So it's my pleasure to introduce, we have three speakers. Rather than introducing all three of them to you at the start, I'm going to do it one at a time. I've got Michael first. So Professor Michael Lee, who is Head of Sustainable Agriculture Sciences at Northwick and Chair in Sustainable Livestock Systems at the University of Bristol. Michael's particular expertise is in the field of grasslands and livestock. We know that ruminant animals have recently had a very bad press for their emissions, but is there a counter-story relating to their role in soil carbon sequestration? And if so, could farming systems which integrate ruminant animals be taken to scale? I think for me, one of the interesting challenges is also whether the science and the issues that we hear, whether they're absolutely representative of UK farming practices. So anyway, with that challenge, I shall hand over.
Thank you very much, Ali. Okay, how do we follow that and how do we follow Gale? It makes you want to go and smash a window, but please don't, bear with me. I make no apologies, I'm going to concentrate on livestock systems because we've had a bit of a bad press and there seems to be a very much black and white view when it comes to livestock, and particularly ruminant livestock. Ruminants produce methane, therefore they're not sustainable. Well, that debate, I think, is a little bit more complex than that black-white misconception. There are lots and lots of shades of grey, and sustainability is a lot more complex than just methane and carbon. That's not to say that carbon is not important. Of course, carbon is important. But sustainability is complex. And if we take an example of a farm and a farm business, we need to think about what the three pillars, which social, economic, and environmental, that farm business needs to provide to be sustainable. So let's have a quick look at those three pillars to begin with. So first of all, societal. A farm business needs to deliver societal need. So what do we mean by that? Well, to begin with, they need to produce a product that society wants and is inherently healthy to society. For example, the tobacco industry, you would not argue is sustainable. It produces a product that society wants, but you wouldn't say it's healthy. Killing your consumer is not a way to be healthy and provide for their needs. So therefore, the farming community needs to produce high-quality, nutritious food, which consumers want, and delivers health. Agriculture is the health industry. The NHS is the illness industry. We heard a little bit about that yesterday. Making people better, it is our job to keep people well. And that's critically a component of that. So next, economic needs. So whilst delivering a product that society wants and is inherently healthy, and we need to think about consumption patterns in that, farms are businesses, and they need to provide a profit. Not just a profit that sees farms tick along by some subsidy payment, but a level that encourages young people to want to be the agriculturalists and farmers of the future. Agriculture needs to be the most sexy industry that everybody wants to be a part of. Feeding 9 billion people in 2050 is the biggest challenge that's ever faced anthropogenic Earth. And therefore we need the best brains, the best ideas. We need entrepreneurs driving agricultural practices. And that does not mean about thinking in silos. We need all the tools in our armament to deliver sustainable production systems, which delivers profits for farmers. Because that's the only way we're going to get the best brains out of banking and into farming. That's what we need. We need a phase shift about what people want to study at university and at colleges. And then finally, environmental need. Whilst delivering products which society wants to inherently healthy, delivering a profit for business, we need to be the first generation that leaves our planet in a better state than we inherited it. We need to ensure that we reduce emissions. We've talked about carbon, and all of this centres around the soil and soil health. And I would say that coming from Rothamsted Research. And I've got a lot of slides, way too many slides, Ali. What I'll try and do is to give you a little overshot, if I've got the time, of some of our latest research in soil health, if I've got time. But, okay, so this is complex. It's phenomenally complex to be able to break up sustainability at a farm system level. And I've tried to do this for an example of beef production, which is an area which I'm particularly passionate about. And we produce a load of trade-offs. And you can think about these metrics at a farm level. Each farmer would understand a whole array of these, which are important to their business. Animal performance, carrying capacity, nutritional quality, the nutrients coming from their farm to feed humans, nutrients lost to soil and water, greenhouse gases, there it is, carbon. It's one of the metrics. It's an important metric, but it's not the sole metric. Sulfonation, eutrophication, animal health, animal welfare, biodiversity, inputs, outputs. My God, if I told a farmer you need to measure all those on all your farms all the time, I think I'll be thrown through the window by Gale. So therefore, we need to think about how research and researchers, institutes and universities can take the risk for our most important stakeholder, which is the farmer, you guys. And that's what we're trying to do at Northwick. So we are taking a farm system level to deliver different types of management systems and measure all those different metrics of sustainability. If we can measure 200 metrics of sustainability on our research farm, where we can take the risk for you, we can tell you the 3 or 4 things you need to measure on your farm to help you improve your sustainable business. So that's a whole key driver for the type of research that we're doing at Rothamsted. And I can see Richard Brook is in the audience. It's good to see you, Richard. See that you've moved to a nice farm. We do miss you, but there we are. We'll catch up later. Richard used to be our manager, sorry. So what metrics are we currently thinking about when we're thinking about ruminant livestock systems? The IPCC metric of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of product is the standard metric which is used for sustainability. And it is what has been undermining red meat production for some time. Now, you speak to any IPCC climate scientist, they will say that this metric was never meant to be used to compare systems. It was a methodology to fully test and start to understand the impact of carbon dioxide. The simplicity of the system of combining methane and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide into one single metric is too simplistic. They are very, very different gases and they react very, very differently. However, classically, this is the comparison that we see when we look at global warming potential on carbon dioxide per kilogram of product. And it is important. Ruminants do give out methane and they are carbon inefficient. But is this the sole and important metric if we follow from my previous discussion? What we've tried to do is think about why actually we don't consume kilograms of product. We consume nutrients. So therefore, let's have a look at the nutritional value of different foods. And we started in a very simplistic view because my background comes from lipid biochemistry and I was very interested in fatty acid profiles of different products. So we did a little bit of analysis and just looked at omega-3 in different animal products. And if you did that, you could actually change the order of the impact metric. But if you looked at the amount of omega-3 delivered per carbon dioxide equivalents, you actually had shifts in the type of production system, either a forage-based concentrate, a forage-based ruminant, or a concentrate-based ruminant system. But of course, and I hope everyone would say to me, Michael, you're not really telling me if we want omega-3, we should just eat red meat. No, of course you shouldn't. You should eat oily fish. But this is just an example of a metric, a nutritional, which started this debate. So we took it further. We actually said then, okay, why is meat on our eat well plate? It's there for essential amino acids, but also some key micronutrients. Particularly, I've already mentioned some omega-3 fatty acids, but calcium, iron, riboflavin, so the other B vitamins, selenium and zinc. but also understanding that protein-based parts of a diet on an eat well plate often have higher levels of sodium and saturated fats. So what we did in this analysis, we took all the livestock products produced within the UK classically, had a look at their nutrient composition and different ways that they can be produced, and developed an RDI metric, a recommended daily intake that you would deliver for all these nutrients if you consumed 100 grams of that product. And then we took away the negative nutrients from that. So classically, this is, this compares, this new metric, this percentage RDI, the key nutrients that you get from protein sources in your diet per 100 grams of meat. And when you do that, you can see actually beef stacks up more favourably than our monogastric friends chicken down here. So actually here on this assessment, beef performs better because of its higher nutrient density. Let's then have a look. This is the classical metric, carbon dioxide equivalents per 100 grams of meat. Classically, chicken performs best. Everyone's saying a more sustainable meat because it produces less carbon dioxide. But I've just shown that beef has a higher RDI. So if you include that within the metric, and you have a look at carbon dioxide equivalents per 1% of delivering those recommended daily intake of nutrients for why we consume protein-based diets, then you will see that beef performs better than these other products. I'm sorry, Phil, lamb still forms not as well because of some of its high methane emissions. This doesn't include hedgerows and trees and pasture, which could potentially reduce that lamb impact. So the next metric, and Ali, I'll try and be as quick as I can, but I think this is important. I've got 2 minutes. Oh, good Lord. Right. Okay, so I'll make this my last point. So, as I said, carbon dioxide is extremely important, but it's not the sole metric. A metric we really also need to consider is about sustainable land use. And classically, when ruminants are considered, they're always hammered on land use because they need a lot of land to produce a small amount of food. However, that metric is not correct because that is saying that 1 hectare of land is the same on every part of the country. And as we already heard from Minette, a hectare in the uplands of Wales is very different to a hectare in Norfolk. So therefore, what we need to look at is a metric associated with arable land use. Arable land should be producing crops that feed humans, not livestock. So therefore, the role that livestock have is to utilize land which is not suitable for growing crops. And nature has delivered a fantastic resource of delivering that, which is ruminants. So we need to reutilize ruminants for their ecological advantage, which is using byproducts and land not suitable for growing crops, and ensuring that crops go to humans. So we did an analysis here of arable land use going into the different livestock species, and you can see that forage-fed beef performs very well. Here you go, Phil. Lamb is on top. So in terms of arable land use to provide humans. But then what we did is we also then included this new RDI. So the amount of arable land to deliver the recommended daily intake of the key nutrients that we need, protein-based components of the Eat Well plate. And when you do that analysis, lamb performs better than any of the other systems, and our monogastric friend chicken, unfortunately, doesn't do so well. But the key and final point then, Ali, is what is sustainability? It's complex, guys. And if we just have one metric, we're going to have one skewed view. And I'm not saying that our new arable land use per recommended daily intake analysis is the most important metric over carbon dioxide equivalents. It isn't. But it's a combination of factors. And we need to think about how we all work together, arable, horticulture, livestock systems to address sustainability. Chasing a single metric is dangerous. The dairy industry did it with milk yield. It's dangerous to chase single metrics. We need to think about a whole array of different aspects of sustainability. So my final picture, because I really, really like it. Livestock, of course, as well, are more than just food. They're aesthetically pleasing. Isn't this a beautiful picture? And I think it's more beautiful because livestock are in it. Of course, we need to moderate consumption patterns. Of course we do. We need to think about how much we consume. Many parts of the world are a vital part of draft and traction power. We heard yesterday we need to rediscover natural fibres-based plant and animal. Animal byproducts are everywhere, as well they should be, because if animals have given up their lives for sustenance, we need to utilize the byproducts most efficiently. Unfortunately, sometimes the drive to slap a vegetarian logo on a product means that we're not utilizing animal-based products most efficiently. And I think a real passion, and needs to be clear debate on that. Think about the £5 note.
Michael.
Nutrients in soil. 2 more. Nutrients in soil. The vital role that grazing livestock have in soil health. And I've got a really great slide on soil health, but I can't use it. And then finally, my favourite picture. Do a lot of work in Africa, thanks to GCR funding from UKRI, got it in there, where these animals are referred to as their bio-ATMs. These farmers do not have banks, they do not have cash points. When there's real drought, their crops dies, but they've still got their livestock. Thank you.
A day was never going to be long enough, was it? Next up is Professor Myles Allen, Professor of Geosystem Science in the Environmental Change Institute, School of Geography and the Environment, and Department of Physics at the University of Oxford. There's a mouthful. Myles, I'm going to just hand straight over to you.
Thank you. Yes, well, this is the talk from the physics professor. There will be maths, there will be graphs, but before you all head for the exit, the government's got it wrong and you could lose out. So I hope I have your undivided attention. This is the open letter Theresa May sent, the defining decision of this generation. This was a point where the government got it absolutely right. They haven't got many things I could say that about recently. But Theresa May has committed us to net zero by 2050, and this is a decision massively to be applauded. I don't know how the organisers of this conference managed to time it straight after this announcement, but well done, you obviously saw ahead. And let me point out to you the way she framed this is exactly the way it should be framed. Ending our contribution to global warming by 2050 can be the defining decision of this generation. That's what we're aiming to do. We're aiming to end global warming. It sounds trivial, but this does have some quite profound implications for you if you're a livestock farmer. By the way, I should have said if you're an arable farmer, you probably could go and get a cup of coffee. This one is not really relevant for you. What will it take to end our contribution to global warming? Well, for carbon dioxide, so on the left here, you've got a chart of emissions in one of these scenarios, which does succeed in stopping global warming. These are global emissions. Carbon dioxide in red, methane in blue, nitrous oxide in green. Carbon dioxide emissions turn around and come down again to zero. There's the grey line there, that's the zero line there. And for carbon dioxide, the answer is very simple. If you want to stop carbon dioxide causing global warming, you've got to stop emitting carbon dioxide. It's a very simple equation. For nitrous oxide, the story is more or less the same. You can see here in this scenario, nitrous oxide emissions don't go to zero, so nitrous oxide continues to cause global warming, and in fact, in order to get global warming to stop, you'd actually have to compensate for those ongoing nitrous oxide emissions with some carbon dioxide removal, which is the kind of thing farming can also deliver. But that's not my focus in this talk. My focus is the blue line in the middle. Methane emissions behave completely differently. You don't need to start to reach net zero methane emissions to stop and indeed reverse methane-induced warming. The dotted lines I'm showing you on the right-hand side, by the way, are just adding up emissions over time from the left-hand side. That's just an integral, okay? We're just taking the areas under the curve, so we're just adding up emissions over time. You can see carbon dioxide emissions, once they get to zero, the emissions added up over time go flat, yeah, because they're not accumulating anymore. That's the same thing, right? So methane emissions are continuing up because continuing to accumulate, but methane-induced warming, the solid blue line, is going down. Okay? So the conventional way of measuring the impact of greenhouse gases on climate that Michael was doing such a great job of slating is completely wrong. Okay? I've been marking exam scripts recently. Here's the X. Okay? Crucially, we can do much better. You can combine cumulative methane emissions and annual methane emission rates with a very simple equation, and you predict the warming response. I promised an equation. Here's the equation. If you need support afterwards, we can talk over coffee. This is in the interest of transparency. You can take a picture of it, and we can come back to it. But let me show you in terms of pictures. These are 3 scenarios for methane emissions. One in which they rise by 25% over 30 years. One in which they fall by 10% over 30 years, and one in which they fall by 25% over 30 years. What global warming would they cause? The first one would cause global warming, the second scenario would actually not cause any warming at all, and the third scenario would cause cooling. The conventional accounting system, endorsed by DEFRA and our government, and even the Committee on Climate Change, which ought to know better, would equate all 3 of these emissions with that amount of CO2, all of which would cause warming, massive amounts of warming. Our alternative way of accounting would equate the first one with a lot of CO2 because it causes warming, would equate the second scenario with no CO2 because it doesn't cause warming, and nor would no CO2 cause warming, and would equate the third scenario with CO2 removal. Here are UK agricultural emissions. By the way, I should credit these slides to Teddy Hornsby, who's at the back there. Teddy's working with us in Oxford on all this. Whenever you hear a university professor, you know there's always a graduate student somewhere in the background. And by the way, if you want to know what your farm is doing to global temperatures, talk to Teddy. So you know who he is. This is UK agricultural emissions on the conventional, flawed accounting system that we still insist on using, even though there are much better alternatives available. This is just emissions in millions of tons per year. There's nothing wrong with that. Tons is a good metric. We redefined the kilo recently, but that wasn't something very important for us here. However, this is combining those emissions using that conventional, flawed accounting system, which makes out, and even Michelle at the beginning of the day said blithely, methane is half the problem, so to speak. Agricultural methane emissions, you can see the blue line there, appears to be dominating the story. These are annual emissions, and then on a scenario, a hypothetical scenario, in which they're brought down to 0 in 2050 to meet the 2050 goal. What would this look like if we accumulate the emissions over time? So if we just add up those emissions over time, they go flat. That corresponds to net zero emissions on the conventional accounting system. That's the black line there as the total. So this is just adding up those emissions over time. So you can see those emissions coming down, and that's why the lines here flatten out. Okay? Now, but I've already told you, this way of accounting for emissions doesn't reflect their impact on global temperature. What if I used a way of measuring emissions that does reflect their impact on global temperature? This is what it looks like. Dramatically different picture. It's exactly the same for CO2 and nitrous oxide. Sorry, there's a slightly different vertical scale there, but believe me, the CO2 and nitrous oxide lines are the same. As I've said, the conventional accounting system is fine for CO2 and nitrous oxide. It's all wrong for methane. Okay? As soon as you start drawing methane emissions down in that scenario, you're actually causing global cooling. And therefore, you should equate those falling methane emissions with carbon dioxide removal, if what you're trying to do is stop global warming, which is what we're trying to do. Let me remind you of that. Okay? So what about an alternate scenario? Just hypothetically, we came up with this one yesterday, say we reduce UK agricultural methane emissions by 20%, instead of 100% between now and 2050. What does that do to global temperatures? Well, what that means is that gentle decline in methane would be enough to fully compensate for the ongoing warming impact of CO2 and nitrous oxide emissions from UK agriculture over the next 30 years. And because that black line there is horizontal, that means that you could say that UK agriculture was no longer causing global warming from tomorrow. Climate neutral UK agriculture. That's a big brand to put on your goods. So, if you haven't understood everything about this talk, let me just give you some of the... But let me point out that it's worth thinking about this. And I know, get out on the streets in your tractors by all means. I hope they're powered by biodiesel. But we've got to do some thinking about this as well, because there are really important things about achieving net zero, particularly for agriculture, which matter. What are the implications here? So reducing power sector carbon dioxide emissions to zero will stop the power sector contributing to global warming, but only when its emissions get to net zero. Yeah, it'll be still causing global warming over all the time that it's reducing emissions, even though you can bet your life that, you know, the oil companies and the power sector companies will be telling you what a good job they're doing, reducing their emissions by 10% over the past decade or whatever. They're still causing global warming. Reducing agricultural sector emissions to zero over the next 35 years or so will cause global cooling. In fact, it'll take your contribution to global warming back to the level it was in the 1960s. For the power sector to do that, they'd have to pump back out of the atmosphere all the CO2 they've put into it since 1960. I'm not hearing any of them volunteering to do that. Question is this a good thing? Well, it depends if you're a livestock farmer, I guess, because as I understand it, it's very difficult for livestock farmers to reduce methane emissions to zero, and it also depends critically on whether you, the livestock farmers, are going to get any credit for helping offset the impact of other people's warming if you're reducing your methane emissions at these kinds of rates. So let me give you a picture to wrap up. These are two equivalent drivers of climate change. Okay? The top one is a closed power station. It caused global warming back in the day when it was running, but now it's closed. It's not causing global warming anymore. It probably wouldn't be charged under the emission trading system for not emitting carbon dioxide. Okay? At the bottom we have a herd of cattle whose methane emissions are declining gently around 10% over 30 years. That might be done with just livestock management, or with some of these new vaccines, which I gather could actually deliver that kind of reduction in methane emissions with no reduction in stocking rates. That herd of cattle is not causing global warming either. But if we carry on with conventional accounting systems, you can bet your life that farmer will be paying through the nose for emission permits for his cattle's methane emissions, even though he or she is not causing global warming. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't make any sense to me, and there is an alternative. If you've been personally affected by the issues raised by this talk, there is a physics professor's explanation of how this works in the slides, which I won't go through now in the interests of time. Chair to note, but will be available in the slides which are available through the Sustainable Food Trust. Thank you for your focus.
Dieter, your work with the Natural Capital Committee has connected up the science and the economics of climate change. Building on the previous two speakers' contributions, we're going to move on now and just see whether we all agree with this economic piece. We're looking for your advice, both to government and to farmers, on how we create an enabling policy and economic framework for farmers to achieve the net zero target.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I was asked to join this panel effectively yesterday, so please excuse me if I haven't prepared a presentation, but the bad news is I do have a presentation this afternoon at the session that I am scheduled for, and in that session I'm going to talk about how to create and sustain a financially viable farming sector into the future, and then I'm going to talk about the broader framework of agricultural policy. But for this session I've been asked to talk about the net zero emissions, and I want to make a small number of points, but I hope that they're both challenging in terms of the policy framework required to get us to where we need to be, but also practical. They're about what this actually means in practice on farms and in terms of the ways in which carbon emissions and carbon sequestration are brought together. So the first point I want to make is a kind of, forgive me for this, I told you so. When I wrote the government's cost of energy review and looked at what was happening in the power sector, I pointed out that the Climate Change Committee had almost entirely ignored the agricultural sector in its plans through to 2050. On the grounds, it was too difficult and too expensive. And I pointed out that this was not a sustainable way of going about achieving the targets, and was actually not correct in thinking about either the difficulties or the cost. Whether one likes it or not, the agricultural sector in Britain is worth about 9 billion, which is about 0.7% of GDP, and therefore the cost to the economy as a whole of imposing costs on the sector, if it is costs that are imposed, is actually a lot smaller than almost any of the other major sectors, in particular transport and power. Now, it's not to say the other sectors shouldn't be dealt with. It's simply to say leaving agriculture out of the equation is not economically sensible if you're looking for an efficient path to get to 80% or net zero, what it might be. It's also extremely practical to do this. So you can't leave agriculture out of this equation. Globally, it's extremely significant. In the UK, it's at least 10% of the emissions for 0.7% of GDP. So if you don't crack agriculture, you won't crack the targets you wish to achieve. And this is about the fact that now agriculture is a serious net emitter of greenhouse gases, whereas in the future, that is going to have to go, and it's going to have to be, or can be, and it's a big opportunity, a net sequestrator. And of course, lots of farmers understandably look to the carbon agenda and say, what am I going to get paid for? But you have to remember this is symmetrical. We're going to have to look to disincentivizing emissions as well as incentivizing sequestration. And this is absolutely critical for farmers who already have soil in good state and already have lots of carbon in their soils and on their farms. Because, of course, the area where you can make the greatest gains in in sequestrating carbon might well be in those areas where farming has been at its most chemical, its most intense, and its most soil stripping. And it's very important that you don't design a system which basically penalizes the good guys and gives lots of money to the people who've done lots of the emitting and continue to do so. And I want to explain very simply in the few minutes I've got available how that comes together. It's both penalizing emissions and promoting sequestration. It's a balance, and it's a balance that requires a level playing field for all farmers, not the highly distorted playing field that the Common Agricultural Policy has given us. So in order to explain how this works, you just have to get one more bit on board, which I think should scare the living daylights out of most farmers unless we get this right. Farmers rightly point to the threat that zero tariffs, and as we've seen in the South America EU trade deal just recently, the threat that agriculture will be chucked to the wolves to lower standards compared with other sectors which are deemed to be more important. Okay? Now, the level playing field in the carbon terms is all about carbon consumption, not carbon production. Okay? The way in which we've achieved the great miracles in Britain of reducing our carbon emissions has not been by helping climate change. What we've done is deindustrialized. It was extremely ironic that when we heard about the net zero by 2050 target and how we were going to make no further contribution to global warming, at the same time we were discussing the closure of British Steel. Well, if we close British Steel, as I pointed out on Radio 4, why not close INEOS and all the other rest of the 20% manufacturing? We will hit our targets much easier, right? And we will do absolutely nothing for global warming. So if you look back over the last 30 years, there isn't a blip in the growth of emissions, but apparently Europe's done very well. Why? Because it's only measuring the carbon emissions in the territory. And the best way of reducing those is to close your carbon-intensive businesses and import the stuff from abroad, because that doesn't count. And that is nonsense. Now, the moment you realise that, you realise the implication for farmers. Because it's pretty easy to see how we can increase global warming and reduce emissions from the farming sector. Why not close it down? Like much of the energy-intensive industries we've done here in Germany and elsewhere. So the crucial thing is that what happens at the border must not lead to a substitution of British relatively low carbon produced products for high carbon intensive imports, because we have penalised the carbon emissions domestically and not dealt with the border. I cannot tell you in accounting terms how important that is. It explains why nothing globally has been achieved since 1990 in reducing global emissions. It's a straight line. It just goes up. While Europe has been apparently decarbonising. How? It's all about imports. And that's not just about tariffs and unfair competition. It's not just about welfare standards, though those are incredibly important. It's also about proper border adjustments for carbon. And if you don't do that, you're lying to yourself if you're making contribution. Do you want to buy beef produced in the Amazon, where 1 hectare a minute is being destroyed for agricultural purposes, in order to displace beef production domestically, and plant a few trees here because we think we might be doing something about global warming? The only honest way of making no net contribution to climate change is to look to our consumption, which includes our imports, and make sure that British farming is on a level playing field. So now the tough bit of news, and then the good bit of news. The tough bit of news is that polluters should pay. And just in case you think, oh, that's not me, I run a non-polluting farm, I bet most of you use red diesel for a start. Why should you have subsidised diesel in a zero-carbon world, right? You're not paying for the pollution compared with other people in the economy. And think about all those inputs that maybe you don't use but other farmers use. About 5 major products in the world account for most or much of world carbon trade. Fertilizers, petrochemicals, cement, steel, and aluminium. Okay? If you look at farm inputs to Britain, if you're really worried about security of supply, by the way, you better start building fertilizer factories and pesticide factories and all that kind of thing, because most of it's imported. Right? And that's carbon production for intensive carbon farming in the UK, which is contributing to global warming. So these inputs need to attract a price to deter people from doing it and level the playing field between intensive farming and some of the farming which apparently is not so economically successful, but because one lot isn't paying for the pollution that the other lot is avoiding. So having proper pollution charges is a way of levelling the playing field domestically as well as levelling it overseas. Now that brings me, that's the downside. You're going to have to pay if you're a polluter. That's the only way we're going to get there, and you're going to have to pay for your carbon consumption, not just your carbon production. You can't make the arithmetic work otherwise. Now here's the good news, the plus side. Farming is also extraordinarily important in sequestrating carbon. It's not just about losing the stuff, it's about fixing the stuff. And we have bold and, if I may say so, extremely simplistic ideas that we're going to forest 20% of the land. Which trees? What sort of trees? What's going to be the impact on the other things you care about that are being extinguished at the same time, like biodiversity? And soils, of course, are important to this frame. So how do you do it? Well, first of all, you need to assess the natural capital that you've got. And now, with satellite data and drones and all sorts of apps and so on, it's perfectly possible to construct an asset baseline You need those assets to be in the balance sheet of your business. You need to work out what capital maintenance is to maintain the level of those natural capital assets intact, including the soils. And then you have to be able to measure from that baseline of natural capital going forward whether carbon emissions have gone up or gone down and how much you've sequestrated. Ask you to do that 5 years ago, pretty much impossible. The speed of the data, the speed of the information, the speed of digitalization transforms our ability to do that. So it's about accounting, it's about ordinary business stuff, and I'll talk more about that this afternoon, and that puts a baseline in, and then you need a price of carbon. Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's the carbon floor price at the moment. It's between 16 and 18 pound a tonne. Should it be 40 pound a tonne? Well, possibly. Should it be less than 16, 18? Probably not. But the point is, there is a price. We're using a price in other parts of the economy. Why shouldn't farmers benefit from the sequestration gains on that kind of price basis, provided the natural capital baseline is put in place, provided it's properly measured, and providing it's independently assured, so we actually know that when people say they're sequestrating carbon, they're actually doing it. But huge opportunity. Final point is, while we're doing all of this, let's remember that farming is much more important than, dare I say, just carbon. As the speaker from Extinction Rebellion was rightly emphasising this morning, we're doing an enormous amount of damage to biodiversity at the same time as we're doing a lot of damage to the climate. And what we must be incredibly careful is not turning the farming sector into a climate change sector to the exclusion of everything else, including food and including biodiversity. There are multiple outputs that farming produces. The business of farming is producing food, like the business of the car industry is to make cars. And we have to remember that there are multiple benefits and multiple costs of all activities. And this afternoon I will talk about how you aggregate the multiple revenue flows that come from the different public benefits that farming can deliver, the public goods, under the 10 headings or 10 goals that are in the 25-year plan. We know what the framework is, we know what the principle is. The job is to turn this into practical numbers, practical returns for farmers, and indeed also practical costs for farmers where they're doing the polluting, so that we can create that sustainable framework. And that's what I will try to set out this afternoon. So, very briefly in conclusion, there is no net zero consumption or production without agriculture. And it's really heartening to listen this morning to the recognition by everyone that there's no alternative. That's great. Even if it's putting you in a corner, at least you're in the corner, you now know what you've got to do. And there's no policy for agriculture which can't take that into account. There is no sustainable future for agriculture unless the tariff and border adjustments are sorted. Otherwise, this could be slaughter for the farmers. Because it could well be we simply mount up the costs, we simply mount up the pressures, and then we sacrifice farming to a deal with Trump or Latin America or somewhere else and import the carbon instead and make climate change worse and decimate our farming sector at the same time. That isn't in anyone's interest at all, but it is the way we're heading until this is properly addressed. And so my final point is, this is practical, this is doable, this is about money, this is about accounts, this is about running farms, running businesses to a new agenda. And as I say, it is achievable, and there is no option but that it must be achieved. And the agricultural bill, the environment bill, must be the mechanism, and I'm quite optimistic about this, by which those things are achieved. Thank you very much.